Hey guys, so in the last lesson, we saw how Flexbox can be declared on a container and how it can start already doing its thing based on the automatic default values. But in this lesson, I want to talk to you about something called flex direction so that we can actually learn how to modify our Flexbox in order to achieve the layouts that we want. When we think about a HTML default flow, normally items get laid out like this. So if they're inline, they'll continue stacking inline until there is no more space. If they are block, they will stack one on top of each other and they will continue like this. And this is the sort of default HTML flow. It goes from top to bottom. As you saw previously with our Flexbox, as soon as we put everything inside a flexible container, all of the items that are contained gets put onto this row. It gets lined up all along like this, and they go one after the other from left to right. And the reason for this is because there is a property in Flexbox called the flex direction. And by default, this flex direction is set to row. So it means that things will be laid out along a row. And it's a little bit confusing because you might think, well, actually, I'm creating columns here, right? But I want you to think about it in terms of how the next item is going to be stacked onto the page. And it's going to be stacked on one after the other onto the same row, until there is no more space and it's still going to try and continue to stack it from left to right. In Flexbox, that means when you have a flex direction set to row, then you're setting something called the main axis. In this case, this is the main axis. It's going from left to right and is on the horizontal. When flex direction is row, main axis is horizontal from left to right. And then there's something called the cross axis. The cross axis goes perpendicular to the main axis. That means in the case where flex direction is row, the cross axis goes from top to bottom. Bear with me here. I'm going to show you the other option. If we didn't set the flex direction, it would default to row. But if we had set the flex direction to column, then what it's going to do is it's going to make all of the items inside this flexible container go from top to bottom. So now what we've done is we've changed the main axis. The main axis is now from top to bottom. And that means that the cross axis is the one that's now from left to right. Now, why does all of these main axis and cross axis even matter? Well, it matters when we want to continue to customize our Flexbox items. Let's take an example property, for example, the flex basis. Now, you could imagine this property almost like setting the height in this case. If we go ahead and increase this height to 100 pixels, then what's going to happen is it will expand along the main axis to satisfy that requirement of the flex basis 100 pixel. Now, this is the thing about the flex basis. If instead of having the main axis along this way, if the main axis was this way, so in the case of flex direction set to row, then remember the main axis is now this way. And so now when we set the flex basis to a larger flex basis, instead of setting the height as we did previously, it's now actually setting the width. When this happens, we're again going to use flex basis 100. And when the code runs, it changes the width of each of the items inside the container to satisfy that requirement. As you can see, along with flex basis and a number of other properties, essentially they are flexing along the main axis. When it's a row, the flex basis is the width, and when it's a column, the flex basis is a height. Essentially, we are flexing along the main axis. That's why the main axis and the cross axis matters when it comes to flex direction. Let's go ahead and try an exercise to see if you can apply a different flex direction to the code that we've set up for you. So go ahead and extract the flex direction folder and open up index.html, and then go ahead and show it inside preview. Now you'll see I've created all the colors of a rainbow inside a container. Now in this case, we've already set it to display flex, and remember by default, the flex direction will be a row. So it's flexing along this direction, left to right, as the main axis. Now the goal, or what it is that you're trying to solve, is to change the layout so that not only are they taller, but also they are aligned along this top to bottom axis. And I can tell you that this height of each item is 100 pixels high. You're going to have to learn to use the flex direction, also what we learned about the flex basis, in order to get this outcome. Now, there is one thing that you might need to be able to achieve this, because remember, the flex basis is set on the child element, so each of these elements, and not on the container, like with display flex or with gap. They're all going on to the container or the parent, but the flex basis has to actually go onto the child. So I want you to take a look at the developer docs that I've linked to see which selector you need to use and how to combine the selectors in order to target all of these divs. Now, because all of these divs don't really share anything in common, for example, they don't have the same class, or they're not a different type of element, I don't want you to change any of the HTML. I want you to use CSS to target just these divs. And we've learned about some of this before when we learned about combining selectors. So if you want to do a quick recap of that lesson, this might be a good moment. Alternatively, you can do what every developer does when they forget how to do something, which is take a look at the documentation. This is a sort of a two-part challenge, but essentially the end outcome is to achieve something that looks like this without changing any of the HTML. Pause the video, have a read through the docs, see if you can figure this out. All right, so let's go ahead and try to solve this. The first thing we know we need to do in order to turn it from this left to right and instead go from top to bottom is we need to change the flex direction. So as I mentioned, the flex direction is a property that goes onto the parent, and we can change it to column so that instead of lining up like this, it lines up from top to bottom. Now, unfortunately, you can see by default, everything is occupying 100% of the width, and we don't really want that. We want it to only occupy as much width as we have content for. This is a little bit of a challenge, but this is something that we mentioned in the last lesson. Instead of having display as flex, where the entire container is going to occupy the full width, we can change it to inline flex, which is going to make it occupy only as much width as it needs to fit the widest bit of content contained in the container. That was a little bit of a revision for you there, trying to catch you out to see if you remember what we learned in the last lesson. The next thing we have to do in order to achieve this goal is to try and make it a little bit taller. And I mentioned that we can do that by using the flex basis property. But I also mentioned that you can't set the flex basis on the container. See what happens if I try to do this. Flex basis on the parent container, let's set it to 100 pixels, and then once it reloads, pretty much nothing happens. This is not a property that's intended for the parent. And remember, when it comes to Flexbox, the container that contains the elements, this is the parent. And each of these items in here, these are the children, or normally we just call them items. How do we target all of the items inside this div? We've got a div called container and we want to get all of its children. Well, if we take a look at this hint, then you can see that we once upon a time learned about combinators, different ways of combining CSS selectors. There's the descendant combinator. There's also something called the child combinator. That is done using this lesser than sign between two selectors, and it matches only the elements where the second selector are the direct children that's matched by the first. This basically says if we have a selector that selects the parent and then we have a selector for the child, then we're only going to select the direct children. And in this case, that's pretty much exactly what we want to do. Now, I also linked to this other MDN doc, which is about the universal selector. So remember, using the asterisk, we can select all the elements. If in this case, what we're trying to select is to select all the elements that are the direct children of the dot container class. The dot container class is our Flexbox container, and in order to get hold of all the children using what we just read from the MDN docs, we can select that container using that right angle bracket as the combinator, and then the children selector that we're going to use is simply an asterisk. And this is going to select all of the direct children, so not the grandchildren or 2 levels down, 3 levels down. So if we had a div inside this div, because this is not a direct child, this is actually a grandchild, then it's not going to be selected by this combination. All the direct children of the dot container class is all of our flexible items. And then we're going to change the flex basis to 100 pixels. And because our main axis is from top to bottom, because we've set the flex direction to column, then our flex basis, 100 pixels, will get applied to each of these child items, and we're able to achieve the final goal outcome. So there were quite a few bits in this challenge, but hopefully you got there in the end, maybe with a few hints from me. But I want you to play around with this flex direction, see what happens when you change it, see what happens when you change, say, the flex basis and you change the flex direction. See what happens when you change the display inline flex to something else. See what happens when you have a flex basis on, but there's not enough widths, and all of these things. For now, don't worry too much about how sizing is handled in Flexbox, because it is one of the weirdest parts of Flexbox, and there's going to be a lesson that I'm going to dedicate to Flexbox sizing. But for now, you can see how lovely our Flexbox flexes along the different axes and how useful this is for creating different layouts. And once you're done playing around with flex direction, head over to the next lesson and we're going to learn more about the different properties that we can apply to the parent Flexbox container. For all of that and more, I'll see you there.